Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this County Mayo History and Heritage webinar. Apologies for the slight delay in getting started. My name is Michael O'Connor. Tonight's webinar is an evening with Captain Gallagher, Highwayman. In July of 1818, a young man by the name of Anthony Gallagher was hanged on the green in Castlebar. In one account, Gallagher, the rope broke when Gallagher was being hanged. He fell to the ground and broke two of his legs, or both of his legs. He was taken back up onto the scaffold, given some wine to drink, and they proceeded to hang him. In the 200 years since the hanging of Anthony Gallagher, tales of Gallagher and his deeds have been told and retold, firstly around firesides, later in the writings of travel writers, and later still in the emerging newspapers like the Connaught Telegraph. And as late as last summer, there was an account in that paper of the lifetimes and demise of Anthony Gallagher. Today, Gallagher is the subject of a number of short stories. He also has his own Wikipedia page, and in the last year or so, he featured in a BBC travel feature. So his story certainly has endured, and it has certainly got out there and is known by people with Mayo ancestry or connection to Mayo across the world. All of these accounts of Anthony Gallagher have two things in common. The first is that the detail differs very little from one account to the next. Even so far as saying, I would even go so far as to say that the language used differs very little from account to account, all the way back to, say, the 1840s. The second thing they have in common is that, notwithstanding that there are a significant number of very useful sources for Gallagher, these accounts are, I believe, without exception, written without recourse to any of these sources. So tonight, I want to start the telling of the Anthony Gallagher story from a different place. I want to put the folklore aside, I want to put the oral history aside, and I want to start with the sources, and I want to start with the facts. And that is what I did when I researched my chapter on Anthony Gallagher for my book, Anatomy of a County Jail. So tonight I want to look at the following key questions or themes. I want to look at or ask or answer, who was Captain Gallagher? When was he active? Some of the folklore would suggest that he was very active in the late 18th century and into the 19th century. How many Captain Gallaghers were there? There is, unfortunately, in most of the accounts, no reference to Gallagher's first name. His first name was actually Anthony. But there is a Captain Red Roger Gallagher that features in a small number of the accounts. So we'll touch on him a little bit later on. Was Gallagher a captain? What does that mean? Was that a sea captain, a military captain, some other kind of captain? Was he a hero or a villain? Certainly in the folklore and oral history, he is, without exception, portrayed as a hero, a Robin Hood-like figure who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. I want to look at what crimes he committed, and more interestingly, what crimes he was alleged to have committed. In the folklore, he is very much portrayed as being a highwayman, a robber of coaches, a robber of wealthy people, a robber of large landed houses on landed estates. Was he the last man hanged in Castlebar? Was he hanged in Castlebar at all? Two questions that need to be looked at. So I want to really look at the at extracting the fact from the fiction and the folklore. And at the end, I want to look at why I believe the story of Captain Gallagher is important. And the reason why I think it's important is slightly different from perhaps the reasons that are that have resulted in the story being told and retold over the many generations back to 1818. So as I said, fortunately, there are quite a number of sources for Captain Gallagher, and the image that I have included here is an extract from what's known as the Petition of Anthony Gallagher. And this is a document that was created in the summer of 1817. It was an attempt by Gallagher and somebody assisting him to save his life. It was unsuccessful. The document is hard to read, but it is nevertheless legible with a bit of work. And you'll notice at the very top right, you may not be able to read it, but you'll see at the very top right the word Sir William Brabazon, and that's who this document was addressed to. And just underneath it, in very faint writing, you can see Petition of Anthony Gallagher. So the last 4 or 5 words of the second sentence. So again, we get, I mean, this is one of the sources for his name. So as I've said, not surprisingly, there are many sources. Documents are to be found in the papers and correspondence of the National Archives of Ireland, and those I found perhaps to be the most helpful in recounting the story based on factual sources rather than on folklore or oral history. There's also official documents like prison reports and crime reports. These do not mention Anthony Gallagher by name, but when you lay them alongside other sources, particularly the National Archives sources, it is clear that the highwaymen, the robberies, etc., they refer to are those perpetrated by Anthony Gallagher and his associates. The newspapers are also a very, helpful source for accounts of the life and deeds of Anthony Gallagher. Firstly, in the period 1816 to 1818, we see many police reports dealing with the hunt for Anthony Gallagher, and also just general reports in newspapers about robberies, arrests, etc. And then later, as I've already mentioned, in the mid to late 19th century, lots of reports appearing in the papers retelling the story of Anthony Gallagher. The Duke of Schools collection is also an excellent source. If you search Anthony Gallagher in the collection, you will come up with 12 hits. 10 of them relate to Mayo, 1 to Sligo, and they are, for the most part, versions of the same theme, very similar, with one exception, one written by John Commons of Bahola, and titled The Robbery of George's House. And the significance of that will become apparent as we move through this. In the early 1840s, travel writer Anne Marie Hall and her husband traveled around Mayo collecting stories, and then she reproduced those in a book that was published in 1843. And there's a very helpful paragraph in that on Anthony Gallagher. And that gives us some good guidance on where the Gallagher story ultimately goes, and how he gets to the execution on the Mall in Castlebar. So who was Captain Gallagher? So rather than sort of building each of these elements up, what I want to do is put them all out there from the start, let you know where I'm coming from on this, and then we can look at the sources that support these. So the first one I put at the top of the list is hanged in Castlebar, August 1818. This is a really important fact. This, for me, is the foundation stone around which the story of Anthony Gallagher gets rebuilt using sources. And it's an important fact because most of the oral histories talk about Anthony Gallagher being hanged in Castlebar in August 1818. So folklore oral history is in agreement on this fact. And happily, the official documents and other reports also record his hanging in August in 1818. So this really is the fact that we can use to reference other facts too. So for example, when we read stories of Anthony Gallagher being active in Mayo in the late 18th century, and then we combine the 1818 date with the fact that we know he was born in 1799 or 1800, he was 18 or 19 when he was hanged, he clearly wasn't active in Mayo, he wasn't involved in 1798, etc. From the petition and a number of other sources, it's clear that his first name was Anthony. he had very strong connections with Swinford, and this comes up time and time again in the sources. No address is given, but it is clear that Swinford is home, or it has become home, and he looks to Swinford and people in Swinford for refuge, and ultimately to say, for example, Sir William Brabazon for assistance in getting out of the trouble he's gotten himself into. Folklore tells us he was born in Bonnyconlon, but he grew up with an aunt at Derrynane near Swinford. I found nothing to contradict this, and I believe that based on the many sources, this is highly probable. He was an Irish speaker. That's probably not surprising. He was a labourer. He rejected the title captain, but he was certainly a highwayman. And I think in this context, we take captain to mean not in the military or the naval sense, but more in the head of a group of bandits, highwaymen, robbers, whatever. He was active in the years 1816 to 1818, possibly as early as 1815, but bearing in mind his age, he's unlikely to have been too much earlier than that. He was not a murderer or a rapist. Now, the murderer thing is supported both by folklore and also by the official records. He did not kill anyone, and there's no evidence that any member of his gang killed anyone. The relevance of the rapist allegation will be revealed very shortly, so we'll just move on. So he had a number of associates. First names for his associates have been impossible to come by, but their surnames include Walsh, Doherty, Clark, and others. They together targeted wealthy landowners, so big houses, big farmers. No evidence that they redistribute wealth. So this is a very important aspect of the oral histories and the folklore, that this Robin Hood-like character was stealing from the rich to give to the poor. There is no evidence of that, but that does not mean it did not happen. Gordon Kennedy, in his fantastic thesis back in 2009 on the Browns of Westport House, linked Gallagher to food riots in Ballina in 1817. These riots are well documented. He also suggests that Gallagher may have been a ribbon man. I'm not convinced about that. He did a lot of things that could be construed as meaning that he was a ribbon man. He did extract oaths from people, but the oaths he extracted were very different from those sought by or extracted by a ribbon man. But I think that is probably an open question as to whether he was or he was not. He undoubtedly had many narrow escapes from the military, magistrates and constables, and they're well documented. The defining moment in the story of Anthony Gallagher is an event which took place on the 16th of November, 1816, at the house of John George of Foxford. This really is a defining moment, and it really is the reason why we have the original documentary sources that we have for Anthony Gallagher. And we'll get on to that event in a moment. So following that event, there was a major manhunt on both sides of the Irish Sea, coordinated by Dublin Castle, and this is well documented. Gallagher, I suppose, ended up being backed into a corner, realized he had no choice, and that death was inevitable, and perhaps with some assistance from a third party, decided to look for a deal, which he did. For a variety of reasons, that was not successful. He was captured, tried, and hanged with his associates in July, August 1818, and he was undoubtedly hanged on the green in Castlebar. So, what happened at the house of John George, curate of Foxford? So John George, in the autumn-winter of 1816, gets appointed to the position of curate of Foxford. He moves into the curate's house at Ballylahan. He hasn't unpacked. He is there a few days. His wife, a daughter, and possibly two daughters have joined him at the house. Late on the night of Sunday, 16 November, the house is attacked by 12 men, led by Anthony Gallagher. Silver plate, items of value, etc., are taken. Some items are broken. A pistol is pointed at George. The trigger is pulled. The pistol misfires. George survives but gets badly beaten. There's an allegation that The women of the house were brutally assaulted. They were undressed. George's daughter had her ears cut to take jewellery. And then the most serious of all allegations that the women of the house were violated. Graphic details of this event were published 10 months later in newspapers in Mayo and across in Britain. Why, you might ask, the 10-month delay? Well, we'll get onto that because it is quite an important aspect of it. So then we have a major public outcry following the publication of the report, and this is in September of 1817. Those hiding or supporting Gallagher begin to distance themselves from him and his alleged terrible deeds. And as a consequence of that, and a reward that's posted, people start to talk to the authorities in Mayo and also the authorities in London. So shortly after the event at Foxford, Noel Horkin, a member of the Swinford Yeomanry, gets intelligence that Gallagher and his associates are held up in a house at Currian near Swinford. So Horkin gets a posse together, including 2 revenue officers, another constable, a couple of yeomen. We have their names. They include a man called Brabazon, another called Cosgrave. They dress themselves in the regalia of the peasantry so that they won't be noticed. They arm themselves with muskets and they make their way to this house. They approach the house obviously very carefully. As they're in the process of surrounding it, a musket is discharged from the house. They take cover, and then an exchange of musketry ensues, and really it comes to naught and a stalemate. So it's decided that the best thing to do is to send, Horkin decides to send Cosgrave to Swinford to Captain Black to bring a detachment of the 68th Durham Regiment of Foot. Now, either because Gallagher and co. seen Cosgrave depart, or because they came to the conclusion themselves that they really did need to get out of there, they decide to break out of the house. A volley of muskets is discharged. They break out the door, and they are met in combat, close combat, by those surrounding the house. Brabazon's musket has been fired, so he confronts one of the men, McGowan, strikes him on the head with the butt end of the musket and kills the man. Another man is captured, and 3 men escape, including Gallagher. So the captured man is likely to be a man by the name of Kavanagh. Kavanagh was brought before Magistrate Patrick Kelly, and he was subsequently tried at the Ballinrobe Spring Assizes in March 1817. Was sentenced to death, taken to the home of John George at Foxford, and hanged outside the home. Now, the records don't say hanged, but that is undoubtedly the method that was employed in dispatching Kavanagh. The other man tried at Ballinrobe was actually not convicted and was released. We don't know what his name was, and we could speculate, but we don't know. So after the siege at Currian, during the period, I suppose the winter of 1816 into 1817, there are many documented sightings of gang members. There are documented accounts of robberies at houses at Foxford. There are many near escapes, including one at Achill, which I am a little bit suspect of because it's quite a bit away from Swinford. But anyway, the account does exist. There are some arrests. One of the problems for Gallagher and the others is that obviously the trial of their associate at Ballinrobe is approaching. So Gallagher approaches the Magistrate Kelly on the road, puts a pistol to his breast or chest, and gets him to swear an oath that he won't pursue the matter any further. Kelly gives the oath, takes the oath, and later renounces it and proceeds as usual. Shortly after that, in March 1817, very early March, Daniel Jones of Manada in Sligo gets intelligence that Gallagher and Walsh are held up at the house of the Ruddy family at Loch Talt, and that they're plotting an attack on the home of Mr. Taft. So learning from the experiences of Horkin, Jones decides to bring the military with him. He goes to Tubbercurry, and in the darkness, with a detachment of the 20th Regiment of Foot, they make their way to the Ruddy House, accompanied by Jones's servant, a number of others, and some of them are mounted on horseback, including Jones. They approach the house, dismount, leave the horses out of sight with Jones's servant, and then they in the darkness creep up to the house and break into the house and find that neither Gallagher nor Walsh are in the house. So where are they? Well, as the soldiers are breaking into Ruddy's house, in the house next door, Gallagher and Walsh awake to the sound of the activities next door, jump out of bed in their night attire, grab a pistol, some ammunition, and exit the bedroom they're in through a hole in the wall that takes them into a cowshed. In the cowshed, they decide very quickly that they're going to part company to increase their chances of escape. They exit the cowshed and disappear into the darkness, but they're spotted. So the party splits in two. The pursuing party splits in two. The parties pursuing Walsh close in on him. Walsh stops, turns, points his musket at one of the soldiers, his pistol rather than musket, at one of the soldiers, pulls the trigger, and narrowly misses killing the man. Excuse me. Those pursuing Gallagher head to the road after him, but he gets to the horses before they do. Using his pistol, he relieves the servant of Jones's hunter and heads off in the direction of Ballina. Somewhere down the road, he encounters a man walking on the road. He dismounts and again uses his pistol to encourage the man to deliver up his clothes to him, which he does. Gallagher remounts the horse and then disappears in the direction of Foxford, where the horse is found a couple of days later. The trial at Battle Road goes ahead. Gallagher and Gills go into hiding. Rumours of escape to England and to America. And then the months pass, and there's not very much activity until you get to July and August of 1817. And in July and August in 1817, the authorities make concerted efforts to capture them. And at this point in time, Dublin Castle is heavily involved in the affair as well. So in late August 1817, William Brabazon receives a petition from Gallagher. He immediately forwards it to George Jackson at Ennisco. Jackson forwards it to Dennis Brown, and with a note to Brown saying that he's not for compromising with people like this, but given that it had baffled his best endeavours to apprehend Gallagher since the assizes, that doing a deal with Gallagher was definitely the way to go. And the deal that Gallagher had in mind was that if he surrendered, they would transport him rather than hang him. So Brown and Jackson agree a deal should be done. Brown gets in touch with Dublin Castle to inform them. But Dublin Castle are on a completely different page on the issue. And in July of 1817, Under Secretary William Gregory actually wrote to John George asking him a very specific question in relation to the affair. Now, Under Secretary Gregory's letter has not survived, but the response from John George has. And from that response, we can easily determine what the question was that was put to John George. And essentially, Gregory asked George for permission to have published in the newspapers a detailed account of the attack on the house and the rape of George's wife and daughters. So when George received this letter, it is evident from his response that he was clearly horrified and troubled by the request. And his distress is really evident from the response that he wrote, because you can see his writing, it becomes very erratic, and you can tell that he's agitated in particular parts of the letter. And we'll look at one of those parts in a moment. So George was also very concerned, and he says this in the letter, that he's concerned that if this false allegation, so the rape did not happen, if this false allegation makes it into the public domain, it will become an undoubted fact. And in fact, that is exactly what happened, because 200 years later, when I find the newspaper reports at a point in time that I have not found the documents in the National Archives, I read these reports and I read that Anthony Gallagher has brutally raped and assaulted a number of women. Now, obviously, when I approach the papers, I do so with a high degree of skepticism and questioning. But anybody reading those papers without having the benefit of the documents at the National Archives, etc., would have taken what was read, or would likely have taken what was read in the papers as an undoubted fact. So whether George consented or whether he was ignored, in September 1870, the Mayo Constitution and other papers began to publish detailed and graphic accounts of the attack and rape of the women at the George home. In September, Michael Farrell, Chief Constable in Dublin, is dispatched to England with another constable to bring Martin and Andrew Walsh back to Castlebar for trial. Now, the hunt for the arrest, detention, and the transfer of these two men back to Mayo could in itself be the subject of a webinar. But just in summary, in the summer of 1817, you have people from Mayo going across to England to work for the summer at haymaking, etc. You get a mixing of people from Mayo with people who are in London. Story goes that these two gentlemen and another man, sorry, not these two gentlemen, but a number of men approached the police saying that they believed that Martin Andrew Walsh and another Gallagher man were the men who were assaulting in Ireland. A police hunt commences, and the men are arrested in various locations, boarding houses in East London. They are imprisoned at Newgate Prison in London, brought before a magistrate, etc. So then there's some work with correspondence with Dublin Castle, with Dennis Brown, etc. in Mayo, and it's decided to bring these men back to Castlebar for trial, and Farrell is dispatched to do that. Now, Michael Farrell is a very interesting character in his own right. There's a lot of detailed documents in the National Archives about him. His descendant, who I have spoken to, has done some research on the family. And interestingly, in the same period, Michael Farrell was also dispatched by the authorities in Dublin to England to hunt for another fugitive from justice and bring him back to Dublin to be tried on a capital charge. And that man was actually Frederick Cavendish, who later became the founder of the Connaught Telegraph. So Michael Farrell, as I say, an interesting character. So looking for a moment at the John George correspondence. Now this is just one paragraph from the letter. There's 4 or 5 pages in the letter itself. And this paragraph in particular was very difficult to read, and not all the text is entirely clear. But what we can see from it is, I suppose, a number of things. Firstly, it is absolutely clear that the alleged rape did not happen, or rapes did not happen. It is also clear that John George fears that a rape may have happened on the night. And that, I suppose, would be an understandable thing for a husband and a father. If you can imagine your house being broken into by armed men in the middle of the night, you know, who knows where it would have ended. But the important fact is the rapes did not happen, something happened. The second thing we see from this little extract is we see George's real difficulty with the publication of this false information. And he is concerned about the women in his house if this becomes a matter of the public domain, even though it's unfounded. But at the end, he does say, unless the cause of justice demands it. And obviously, he was convinced by somebody that the cause of justice did demand it. And I'm not sure who that somebody would be or was. It was more likely or most likely Gregory, in conjunction with perhaps Dennis Brown, and perhaps also through maybe further correspondence with John George, although things were moving very, very quickly. So it's difficult to see where there would have been time for much debate around this particular issue. Also, just to look at the petition or flag of truce dated the 25th of August, 1817. As I said earlier, addressed to Sir William Brabazon. This is very important because, again, it centres the story in Swinford. Brabazon was based in Swinford. Gallagher was effectively writing to his local councillor or TD for a dig out on this terrible problem. He's seen Brabazon as being the most likely person to help him. The letter was in English. Gallagher didn't write it. He says in the letter that he only spoke Irish. So the letter was likely written by a priest. It's written by an educated person. It's well written, well structured. There's a good vocabulary in it. And so I do believe it was written by a priest. Gallagher signs the letter with his mark. In the letter, he tells Brabazon that he's 18 or 19 years old. He's a labourer, speaks Irish. He's not guilty of the charges levied against him. And then critically, he says he never molested man, woman, or child. And these are very important words. And though he doesn't mention John George, the events of the 16th of November of the previous winter, it is clear that this is a reference to what happened at Foxford, and also an attempt by Gallagher to, if not disassociate himself with the robbery itself, but to disassociate himself with and deny that there was ever any personal assault on the occupants of the house. And it's also, I suppose, interesting that he, includes woman or child in it, and that obviously harks back to the allegations that were floating around. So he tells Brabazon he doesn't know why he's called a captain. He doesn't know what the word is. He doesn't speak English. But I think probably that's one of the elements of the letter that is probably more self-serving than some of the others. He's in hiding because of the large reward offered for his capture. That is undoubtedly true. And he's also in hiding because there are military detachments traveling around the county looking for him. And then finally, he agrees that he will, or offers to surrender on condition that he would be transported. Very unclear how this would work in practice, because if he surrenders to Brabazon or any of the magistrates, then that would then lead to a criminal charge being laid against him as a matter of law. It would be there would be determination as to whether he'd be tried, a jury. If he was tried, then there would be a verdict. It's hard to see how he would not have been found guilty of highway robbery at least. If he was convicted or sentenced to death, it would be a matter for the Lord Lieutenant to commute that to transportation. So there'd be lots of risks in that approach for Gallagher. A lot could happen along the way. The other alternative, and it's something that I did have seen evidence of during, say, 1798, where somebody agrees to get on the ship and go to wherever it might be, and that there's no court-martial or criminal trial. But in this case, it never got to that because the surrender never happened. So is the letter a reliable source? I believe it is to an extent. Certainly, Dennis Brown, Jackson, and Brabazon, and they were no fools. They believed it to be the genuine article. It certainly was a letter that came from, albeit not written by, this Anthony Gallagher. I think Gallagher and those advising him or writing the letter had to strike a balance between putting things into the letter, knowing that ultimately, if the deal was done, that they would meet Anthony Gallagher. So there had to be a degree of truth in it around his age, around perhaps he's speaking Irish, those kind of things. And so I think that we can rely on the letter to a certain extent for some personal facts about Anthony Gallagher. So the capture of Anthony Gallagher, there is no official source for the detail of the capture of Anthony Gallagher. But captured he was. And what's interesting here is that all of the documents, material, and engagement we've been talking about happened in July, August, and September of 1817. Anthony Gallagher and his associates were not tried until the summer assizes of 1818. So why were they not tried at the spring assizes of 1818? That is very curious, and it suggests to me that their capture happened later than March 1818. So March, April, May, June, in time to bring them before the court in July of 1818. So according to the folklore, the capture occurred at the home of a friend while Gallagher was recovering from an illness. Whilst I found nothing to support this, I found nothing to contradict it either. But one little fact that I think helps a little bit in the analysis, and that is that in September 1819, so 1 year after the hanging of Anthony Gallagher, the home of Charles Oliver of Lisbragan near Swinford is burned in an arson attack. Deliberately attacked, deliberately burned. And in the detail around that burning, it's noted that his wife assisted in the prosecution of Gallagher. So again, we've got another strong connection between Gallagher and Swinford. You know, could Charles Oliver's wife have been the woman who betrayed him in Swinford? We don't know, but it is an interesting fact. It is very clear at this time that there were a lot of people giving evidence against Gallagher, either formally or informally, and obviously looking to secure some or all of the reward that was posted. So, learning from the mistakes of Horkin and learning from the mistakes of Jones, it was decided, according to folklore, that a significant detachment of what they call redcoats would be taken to this house. So a number up to 200 were drawn from different parts in the county, surrounded the house. Gallagher, accepting that it was the end, surrendered and was taken. He was imprisoned at the jail on the Green with associates named Walsh, Doherty, and Clark. And interestingly, also in prison with them at the time was Thomas Gilroy. He was charged with the murder of Thomas Wallace of Killala, and he clearly shared a cell with Gallagher and the others. So all of them, including Gilroy, were tried in July 1818. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find any record of the trial of Gallagher and his associates, and that's obviously quite a shame. It may turn up sometime in the future, but I certainly have not found it. But I have found a record of the trial of Thomas Gilroy for the murder of Wallace. And that in itself is a particularly interesting and newsworthy trial. Gilroy was tried by Charles Kendall Bush, and if any of you are familiar with my writings on the trials of the Treshers in Castlebar in 1806, you'll know that Bush was involved in those trials as well, and that in the winter or December of 1806, several men were hanged on the Green in Castlebar. So Gilroy comes before Bush, tells Bush he doesn't want a trial. He says that he killed Wallace, that his God knows he killed Wallace, and that he could not swear otherwise. Bush spends a lengthy amount of time convincing Gilroy of the merits of a trial. Ultimately, Gilroy agrees, noting that he may yet be acquitted. Gilroy conducts his own defense. He's got no lawyers, and he does an exceptionally good job of defending himself, and does a really good job of implicating the principal witness in the murder. Now, had he not arrived in court telling everyone that he had actually committed the murder, there is a reasonably good chance he may have been acquitted. But he was not acquitted. He was sentenced to death, and and put back into the jail in Castlebar to await the execution. Now, in some of the accounts in the folklore and essays around Captain Gallagher, it is said that Gallagher and his associates were subject to a sham trial. There's absolutely no evidence for this. If you look at what happened in the Gilroy trial, that wasn't a sham trial. There was a legal process. There were many, many shortcomings in that legal process, lack of legal representation, a very quick trial, evidence not properly examined, all those things. But they were features of all the trials at that time. So Gallagher, was tried in the same way I would say that many others were tried at that time, with all the shortcomings of the procedures. So after their trial, they're all sentenced to death, returned to their cells, and the first among them to be executed is Gilroy. And after Gilroy is hanged, now Gilroy was convicted of murder. So anybody convicted of murder, then the law mandated that following their execution, they were either to be dissected, or hanged in chains, or gibbeted as it was called. So dissecting in Castlebar meant being taken from the jail on the green, across the green to the infirmary, where they would be dissected by the surgeons there. Hanging in chains in Castlebar meant either being gibbeted on the mall, or possibly at the place where the crime was committed. In this case, in Killala. We don't know. For some reason or other, Gallagher and the others asked Governor Moore and the governor of the jail to view the remains of Thomas Gilroy, and their request was allowed. And we have a really good source of this, because somebody wrote a letter to one of the English newspapers recounting the reactions of Gallagher and the others on viewing the remains of Gilroy. Now, the remains of, and I've written in detail about this in Anatomy of a County Jail, the remains of somebody hanged on the green in Castlebar would be grossly disfigured, and would have undergone other terrible bodily processes. So viewing the remains of an executed criminal would have been a pretty shocking experience for anybody. And I think this is very evident from the reactions of Gallagher, Doherty, and the others. So in this letter, we're told that the request was granted, and the shock they received on beholding his distorted countenance was very great indeed. The stout heart of Gallagher was immediately subdued, and he gave vent to his strong emotion by loud and piteous shrieks. This unfortunate man had hitherto conducted himself with much fortitude, divested, however, of any unbecoming hardihood, either of temper or conversation. Doherty, who from the moment of his conviction was outrageously vindictive, has, we hear, assumed a rather calm state of mind. Welch and Clark are not remarkable in any part of their conduct. The four admit, we understand, the justice of their sentence, which is too palpable to be doubted, even though they should choose, as is commonly the case, to deny it. But they feel comparatively happy in the reflection they have not, in their guilty career, deprived any person of life. And I just wonder really if that last line in particular may just have been added on by whoever the author of the letter may have been. We just don't know. So I believe that Anthony Gallagher and his associates were hanged on the 29th of August from gallows erected on the green, probably just in front of what was the old jail, now the motor tax office, that fine red building that is on the corner of Spencer Street beside the courthouse. That was not the building that was there at that time. That building was built in the 1870s. The jail was demolished before that. Gallagher was not hanged from the hanging tree. That's sort of a big part of the folklore and oral history. And he certainly was not the last man hanged on the green in Castlebar, as is often recounted in the folklore. And he wasn't the last man by a mile, unfortunately. Because the crime was, and this I suppose is interesting, Gallagher was convicted of burglary. He wasn't convicted of assault, he wasn't convicted of rape, murder, any of those things. And the same is true for his colleagues. So they were all convicted of burglary. So therefore, the dissection and hanging in chains aspect did not apply. So it's likely that their remains were returned to family and friends and buried somewhere else in the county, in Swinford or Foxford or somewhere like that. I think the folklore does talk about that, but I've not found any what I would call evidence or hard or otherwise of that fact. So Anne-Marie Hall, writing in 1843, says that Gallagher figured in 1817 and 1818. He died fearfully. He and his secretary Walsh, having shaken hands and kissed on the gallows, were flung off together. Walsh died at once, but Gallagher's rope broke and he was precipitated to the ground. He got a glass of wine and was again showed out onto the trapboard for the executioner, seated like a tailor, his legs having been broken by the fall. Do we know if this happened? It could have happened, and I could certainly cite more than one example for each of the elements of that sentence in terms of others who were hanged on the Mall in Castlebar. So this could easily have happened. In 1818, hanging was an exceptionally crude business, and they did not engage with the dark science of effective hanging really until the 1870s. So all these things could easily have happened. The rope was often too long. No effort was made to understand the relationship between height of the man, the length of the rope, and the distance to the ground. And similarly, no effort was made to understand the relationship between the strength of the rope and the weight of the individual being hanged. So possibly all of these things could have happened, as could the glass of wine aspect as well. So, legacy and conclusions. I mentioned earlier on the possibility of there being other Captain Gallaghers. The folklore rarely gives a first name. I believe that the accounts of the folklore that we read, with very few exceptions, are all talking about Anthony Gallagher, who died in the Mall in Castlebar in August of 1818. Men like Roger Gallagher would seem to me to be creatures of the late 18th century and possibly had connections with 1798. I spent a lot of time looking for Red Roger Gallagher. I found absolutely no evidence of the man's existence outside of some references in folklore and songs. It's interesting that Richard Hayes and Desmond McCabe and other historians who have created lists of those court-martialed, hanged, transported, all of those things from 1799 do not include Red Roger Gallagher in their list. I very reluctantly included him in my list in Anatomy of a County Jail, but I did put a sort of a health warning in there to say that this chap may not have existed. We just don't know. Gallagher is undoubtedly a folk hero in County Mayo. I don't believe, for the most part, anything I found changes that. In fact, it probably makes his story considerably more interesting and exciting, because the police hunts, the manner in which Dublin Castle coordinated these hunts, the correspondence with Dublin Castle and London, and with Dublin Castle and Mayo, are all aspects that are, in their own right, incredibly interesting and make the story much more interesting. For me, the status as a folk hero really turns on what happened in the home of John George. Clearly, we can be confident that the women in the house were not raped, but I don't think that we can be confident enough to say that these poor women and John George himself did not experience some sort of terrible, terrible event, and were not, scared that they would lose their lives or worse. And I think we also need to look at it from the perspective of a father and a husband, and the imminent prospect of these terrible things being done. There's no doubt that Gallagher has been embellished in the folklore. We often read accounts of that Gallagher was dressed with a fine frill shirt, a trademark a highwayman jacket or coat, and hat, breeches and boots, and had a fine horse, an array of blunderbusses and pistols. And I think that most of this is really is fanciful stuff, and is not bore out by the evidence. Gallagher would be seeking to keep his profile as low as possible, and I think we are more, likely to find that Anthony Gallagher was, a young labourer, dressed as such, who probably had a couple of pistols, borrowed a horse when he needed it, and may, in many cases, have simply operated on foot, like the gentleman in the image that I posted at the very beginning of the presentation. So as I said, the story of Anthony Gallagher is no less interesting. It gives us important insights into policing, into the modus operandi of Dublin Castle, and I suppose the despicable way they went about flushing out Anthony Gallagher without regard to anyone, including the women of the George household. But before I finish, I know that you'll have loads of questions on the gold at Barnalira Wood and all the folklore around Gallagher having offered up his treasure in return for the guards at the jail, the Green and Castle Bar, releasing him from the jail and letting him escape. But what I can say is that there is a long tradition, or there was a long tradition, of prisoners in Castlebar buying their freedom from military guards at the prison. Now, when I say military guards, I say that deliberately, not civilian turnkeys. Civilian turnkeys worked there, for long careers. They had no interest in getting associated with this kind of activity. Military guards came and went. The regiments moved around. Soldiers were a little bit freer and easier with their loyalties. And there are many examples of families getting silver in particular brought into the jail to be used to bribe guards. And it was used without effect in November of 1806 by the threshers who were awaiting trial there to escape, but it didn't work. There's a report from the 1830s that states that, official report that states that military guards at prisons in Ireland enabled more escapes than they prevented. So I have no doubt that Anthony Gallagher and the others offered something up to try and buy their freedom. They were desperate. It was the done thing, and they would have been fools not to have done so. Did they have the gold that they were offering up? Well, they could have. I mean, we know from some of the houses, like particularly the George house, they took silver plate, etc. That's not the kind of stuff you would carry around in your back pocket or on the back of your horse. You would secrete it somewhere. Now, of course, the folklore tells us that they distributed their wealth, but I think we can take that to a certain extent with a pinch of salt. So there must have been a cache of items somewhere. Clearly, Gallagher was on the run for a long period, so he would not have had much time, I think, to move it around. Is there this cache of gold and silver in the woods near Knock Airport, Mayo International Airport? I don't know, but if any of you find it, it would be great to let us know, and we can adjust the narrative to confirm that this aspect of the folklore is undoubtedly true. So that's the end of my slides. If you're looking for a lot more detail on this, if you're looking for my sources and some of the names, then there's an entire chapter devoted to this in Anatomy of a County Jail, which is in the bookshops and online, published last September. And so I would encourage you to go and go and have a look at that. The one thing I would emphasize is that this for me was not a genealogy project. So I've had a lot of questions over the last number of months on the parentage and relations of Anthony Gallagher. What I can say to you, my research has been very meticulous, very detailed, and I've looked at a lot of documents, and I have not revealed any evidence of who the parents of Anthony Gallagher were, who any of his siblings were, any descendants were. So I think that, I'm not saying that these things aren't out there, but I'm saying that right now I don't have the answers. I would love to know the answers. I will continue to keep an eye on it. But I think it's for anybody looking at this specifically, it's a very tough conundrum. And I think also the Gallagher name is very common in that part of Mayo in that period. And I think if you go through the criminal records, you also find a lot of Gallagher men who were involved in burglaries, robberies, etc., that fell into other categories like just plain criminality or ribbon man activity, etc. I think perhaps the fact that his name is Anthony may give somebody a steer or a bit of help, but beyond that, and the fact that I do believe the connection with Swinford is very strong, there's not much more I can add to it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to look in the chat and see if there are any questions, and I'll do my best to answer them for you. So this is I've got a question from Declan McKibben, who asks, can you speculate on who the priest may have been who wrote the Gallagher petition? That's a really good question, Declan, and to be really fair to you, I never thought about that. I didn't go looking for him, but that's something that that we could certainly look for, because the detail of who the priests were at that time would have been known. A lot of the names and survived, so that's certainly something we could definitely have a look at. I've got two questions raised by attendees. So firstly, Mary Arrigo. So I'm on muting you now, Mary. Can you hear me?
Okay. Hello. I just wondered if anybody knows what he looked like. Are there any descriptions? Because there was a very handsome young man going around dressed as him in some of your posts. But do we know, did anybody describe him?
No, there's no, there are quite a few descriptions of his, I suppose, his mental state at different times. I've speculated around that. The direct answer to your question is no. I have speculated, and it is a bit surprising because, he was wanted, and I didn't find, though I found one kind of wanted type notices, etc., I found no pictures or drawings or descriptions in police gazettes. But I mean, what do we know about him? And clearly he was very fit because he was able to move very, very quickly. He was a young man. He would have been from the labouring, he was undoubtedly from the labouring classes. So I would imagine that, his stature would have been light. He would have been, I would imagine, skinny, fit. Beyond that, I couldn't say. I wouldn't wish to speculate. One of the things I've been trying to do with this story is to sort of pull people away from 200 years of folklore and myth, and try and, I suppose there's a page online, I think on his Wikipedia page, and he could be Brad Pitt, or he could be I don't know, Michael Fassbender, or any of those chaps, and he wasn't any of those people. He certainly didn't climb the gallows in a frilly shirt like was said, or have any of those regalia. So we can just, at this stage, we can just speculate, Mary.
It just seems strange that there's no description of him physically in any of the reports or the court's reports or anything.
The difficulty, I suppose, with the sources is, and this is why you have to be so careful with them, that there's a terrible randomness to them. You can get something that is so specific, and like, for example, the details of the attack are so specific that you end up finding out that they're actually all fabricated. And you can find, for example, the attack by Horkin on the house in Swinford. The detail around that attack is, really, really good. What they wore, how they approached the house, what arms they had. They didn't dog with them. Okay, he didn't get his name, but there was a dog. So all those things are there, and then you get, for example, no report of the trial, which I find to be quite incredible in some things. But I suppose part of it could also be the fact that I mentioned earlier on the Mayo Constitution. I never found any original account for the Mayo Constitution. But I did find the Mayo Constitution account in UK papers. Some of them are obscure in UK papers, English papers. And so it sort of suggests to me that that edition of the Mayo Constitution, and that maybe that whole year of the Mayo Constitution has yet to be discovered somewhere.
Yeah.
May not even exist. So, it could also just be the lottery of what's survived and what has not survived.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Very good. So next I'm going to allow, actually Sean Horkin to talk. So Sean, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Sean, can you hear me? Hello, Sean. Okay, so I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not getting Sean. While I'm waiting for Sean, is there anybody else who may have any questions? So Eamon Gallagher, I'm just getting you now. Okay. Hi, Eamon.
Hi, Michael. How are you? Hello, can you hear me?
Very good. Have you got a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you got any plans to do this once everything gets back to normal, and do you plan to do this publicly in open forums and things like that, going around maybe County Mayo talking about this?
Oh, Eamon, I cancelled a whole lot of events I planned last September. I would love to do this. I would love to do this around Mayo and have plenty of plans to do so. I'm just reluctant to formalize anything because it's just right now so uncertain.
No, I hear you.
Yeah, I'm planning to do. I have a whole rake of things that I want to do, and I would really love to engage with people face to face around Captain Gallagher because he is so important. And it's such a big part of the folklore of Mayo. And I know, like, so many people have come back to me on the email over the last 6 months saying, well, did you know this and did you know that? And I think what I've been saying to people is, what I want to bring to the table is all of this factual stuff. And then to sit down with people who are really engaged with the local folklore and know where the graves are and know where the buildings are and know where for example, the rectory in the curate lives in Foxford, and show me these places, and then we can try and build a real good picture of who this man was, and then try and update the narrative, and maybe even try and prepare some sort of mini documentary on the thing if people are interested in doing that. So undoubtedly, yes is the answer.
Yeah, because I mean, I didn't hear about him until probably at the start of lockdown last year, and I grew up in the areas that he was in, because Derry Ronan and Currion are actually in midfield just outside Swinford, where I grew up, and I never heard anything about him. And actually, a few people back home that I spoke to hadn't heard anything about him either. And it's quite kind of strange that nothing like this was ever talked about in my childhood, and yet he lived around midfield. Yeah,
and I think you find that with a lot of the history of Mayo. Gallagher I did hear of, and I certainly did hear of him growing up. But that could be as much to do with the fact that I was a bit of a history nerd as a kid, more than anything else. There are. I think one of the great things about this story is the sieges and the police investigations. They are just so revealing of a period in time, and rather than constantly saying, he was hunted by the redcoats and the terrible Dennis Brown, we can actually deconstruct that and rebuild it with some fantastic little bits of fact that make the story just so engaging. And you could see this being being taken from a great bit of folklore into almost a narrative for a little movie or something, because it is really exciting stuff. And it's, to the extent that we can, we don't need to do, in my view, an awful lot of embellishing to actually, bring the facts to life a bit more, because that's already been done by the school children in the schools collection and by the newspapers and by, local historians for decades.
No, for sure. Thanks very much for that, Michael. I appreciate it.
Very good. And I'm going to try one more time to unmute Sean Horkin, because I'd very much like to hear what Sean has to say. Yeah, for some reason I'm not unmuting Sean. Just seeing it. Okay, so Gareth Horkin has asked me in the chat, who was the Horkin policeman? Was he local? Any information on him? So he was a member of the yeomanry, which was, I suppose, a unofficial local area military protection force that would be called up for moments like this to deal with serious issues. I mean, the yeomanry played the Protestant yeomanry played a very important role in the suppression of the 1798 rebellion, by way of an example. He was definitely from the Swinford area, I can tell you that. And do I have any more information on him? The answer is no, but I have not really gone looking. So I think there could well be information on him, because he was in the yeomanry, and there would certainly be a good possibility that there would be lists of yeomanry that have survived in the newspapers and perhaps in some of the military archive type documents. So sorry I can't say any more, Gareth, but I think there is potential there for sure to get more on him, as there is on the others who were involved in that particular engagement. Do we have any final questions? Okay, well, again, thank you all very much for giving up time this evening to attend this. I look forward to talking to you all again after the summer break, and maybe even meeting some of you over the summer down in Mayo. Apologies for some of the technical issues with tonight. I had some difficulty getting the thing up and running at the start, but hopefully it didn't cause too much disruption. And I'm hopefully going to share a recording of this if the recording has worked from a technical point of view. Thank you.